The rain hammered against the marble steps of the Blackstone estate as I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 2 figures knelt at my front door, their designer clothes soaked through, their pride washed away like yesterday's makeup. My parents, the same people who threw me out on the street 3 years ago when I was 6 months pregnant. Now they were begging to meet their billionaire grandsons. "Mommy, why are those people crying outside?" 5-year-old Ethan tugged at my Hermes dress, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity. His twin brother Lucas looked up from his iPad, equally puzzled by the scene unfolding beyond our security gates. "Just some people who made very bad choices, sweetheart," I whispered, my voice steady, despite the storm raging in my chest. They had no idea that the woman they discarded like trash now controlled an $8 billion empire. They had no idea that their grandsons were heirs to the Blackstone fortune. And most importantly, they had no idea that I remembered every single cruel word they'd ever said to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all began. Back to when I was just Emma Martinez, the unwanted daughter who could never measure up to her golden boy brother. Growing up in the Martinez household was like living in the shadow of a monument dedicated to Marcus, my older brother. From the moment I could walk, I understood my place in the family hierarchy. Dead last. Marcus was the star quarterback, the straight A student, the son who would carry on the family name. I was the accident that happened 5 years later, the daughter who was always just a little too loud, a little too clumsy, a little too much of everything my parents didn't want. "Emma, why can't you be more like your brother?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. When Marcus brought home a trophy, there were celebrations. When I brought home an A on my math test, it was met with a distracted, "That's nice, honey," before my mother went back to fussing over Marcus's college applications. The worst part wasn't the constant comparisons, it was the absolute indifference. At least when they were criticizing me, they were acknowledging I existed. Most of the time, I was invisible. A ghost haunting the edges of family photos, forgotten at school pickup, overlooked when deciding who got the last piece of birthday cake. My 16th birthday crystallized everything I already knew about my place in their world. I woke up that morning with the naive hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the day they remembered I mattered. I'd dropped hints for weeks about wanting a simple dinner, maybe a small cake, nothing fancy, just acknowledgement. Instead, I found my parents frantically preparing for Marcus's college recruitment dinner. The dining room was decorated, caterers were arriving, and my mother was wearing her best dress. For a moment, my heart lifted. They'd remembered after all. "Mom, this is beautiful," I said, touching one of the elegant centerpieces. "I can't believe you did all this for Marcus's recruitment dinner." "Yes," she cut me off without looking up from her clipboard. "The coach from Stanford is coming tonight. This could change his entire future." The words hit me like a physical blow. "But it's my birthday." My father glanced up from his tablet, looking genuinely confused. "What's that, Emma?" "Today, it's my 16th birthday." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's pen froze mid-checklist. Marcus, who'd been adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, stopped moving entirely. But it was the look of mild annoyance that crossed my father's face that broke something inside me. "Oh, honey, "We'll celebrate next weekend," my mother said dismissively, already turning back to her preparations. "Tonight is too important for Marcus's future." I stood there in my favourite dress, the one I'd carefully chosen for my sweet 16, watching my family orchestrate the perfect evening for my brother, while treating my birthday like an inconvenient scheduling conflict. That night, I sat in my room listening to the laughter and celebration downstairs, eating a gas station cupcake I'd bought for myself. That was the moment I stopped hoping they'd love me the way they loved Marcus. That was the moment I realised I would always be the afterthought, the inconvenience, the daughter who existed on the periphery of their real family. College was my escape. I threw myself into my studies, working part-time jobs to minimise how much I had to ask them for. During holiday breaks, they'd pepper me with questions about my grades, my major, my plans. But it always felt like they were checking items off a parental obligation list, rather than genuinely caring about my answers. The night I graduated summa cum laude, with a degree in business administration, my parents arrived 20 minutes late because Marcus had called with news about his promotion at his law firm. They took exactly 4 photos, I know because I counted, before rushing off to celebrate Marcus's success at dinner. I ate alone at a campus diner, my diploma propped against the salt shaker, but then I met Alexander, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered to someone. I was 22, working as a junior analyst at a consulting firm in downtown Chicago. Alexander Blackstone walked into our office building lobby on a Tuesday morning in October, and I swear the entire world shifted on its axis. He was tall, devastatingly handsome, with dark hair that looked effortlessly perfect, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. But it wasn't just his looks that captured me, it was the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the reception desk where I was waiting for the elevator. His voice was smooth, confident, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I'm looking for the Morrison Group offices?" 32nd floor, I managed, trying not to stare at the way his expensive suit fit perfectly across his shoulders. "Are you here for the Hartwell acquisition meeting?" He smiled, and I felt my knees go weak. "You know about the Hartwell deal?" I wrote half the preliminary analysis, I said, then immediately felt heat rise to my cheeks. I probably sounded like I was bragging, but Alexander looked genuinely impressed. "Then you must be Emma Martinez. I've read your work. It's exceptional." That he knew my name, had read my analysis, thought my work was exceptional. It was more professional validation than I'd received in months. But more than that, when he looked at me, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked as the elevator arrived. "I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on the acquisition market." Coffee led to dinner. Dinner led to long walks along Lake Michigan. Long walks led to nights talking until sunrise about everything and nothing. For 6 months, Alexander made me feel like I was the centre of someone's universe. He never made me feel like I had to compete for attention or prove my worth. With him, I was enough exactly as I was. He was mysterious about his work, always travelling, always taking important calls in hushed tones. He said he was in international business development, which seemed to require him to fly to different cities at a moment's notice. But when he was with me, he was completely present. He'd turn off his phone, ignore his emails, and make me feel like I was the most important thing in his life. "I've never met anyone like you, Emma," he whispered one night as we lay tangled in the sheets of his downtown penthouse. The Chicago skyline twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You're brilliant, beautiful, and you have no idea how extraordinary you are." I pressed my face against his chest, inhaling the scent of his cologne, mixed with something uniquely him. "My family would disagree with that assessment." "Then your family is blind," he said fiercely, tilting my chin up to look at him. "You're going to do incredible things, Emma Martinez. I can feel it now." Those words meant everything to a girl who'd spent her entire life being told she wasn't quite good enough. The night I found out I was pregnant, Alexander was supposed to return from a business trip to London. I'd planned the perfect evening, his favourite dinner, candles, soft music. I had the pregnancy test wrapped in elegant paper, ready to share the news that would change our lives forever. But Alexander never came home. I waited until midnight, calling his phone over and over until it went straight to voicemail. I texted, I emailed, I even called the hotel in London where he said he was staying. Nothing. Radio silence. Days turned into weeks. His penthouse sat empty, his belongings gone. It was as if Alexander Blackstone had simply vanished from existence. I went to his office building, but security claimed they'd never heard of him. The business cards he'd given me led to disconnected numbers and fake addresses. Pregnant, alone, and completely confused. I did the only thing I could think of. I went home to my parents. The Martinez family home in suburban Detroit looked exactly the same as it had when I left for college. Same beige walls, same family photos that somehow never seemed to include me prominently. Same feeling of being an outsider looking in. But now I was 6 months pregnant, desperate and running out of options. I found my parents in the living room, my mother reading a magazine, while my father watched the news. Marcus was there too, lounging in his favourite chair with his girlfriend Sarah draped across the armrest. Sarah Wellington, blonde, beautiful, and cruel in the way that only someone who'd never faced real hardship could be. "Emma," my mother said, looking up from her magazine. Her eyes immediately went to my rounded belly, visible despite my loose sweater. "Oh my God, what have you done?" "I'm pregnant, Mom," I said quietly, my hands instinctively moving to protect my stomach. "The father, he's gone. I need help." The silence that followed was crushing. My father muted the television and suddenly all eyes were on me, but not in a good way. Not in a supportive, loving family way, in a judgmental, disapproving way that made my skin crawl. "Who's the father?" my father demanded, his voice cold. "His name is Alexander. He disappeared. I can't find him anywhere." Sarah let out a little laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Emma, you always were naive." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah stood up, smoothing down her designer dress with a smug expression. "I mean, men don't just disappear unless they want to, unless they're running from something or someone." "That's not what happened," I said weakly, but doubt was already creeping in. Had I misread everything about Alexander? Had our entire relationship been some kind of elaborate lie? "Sweetheart," my mother said, using the condescending tone she reserved for when she thought I was being particularly stupid. "Men like that don't end up with girls like you unless they want something, and once they get it—" "Girls like me?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Come on, Emma," Marcus chimed in, not even looking up from his phone. "You're not exactly the type guys write home about." He probably got what he wanted and moved on. Each word was like a dagger to my chest, but it was Sarah who delivered the killing blow. "Actually," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails with theatrical casualness, "I might know something about your mysterious Alexander." Everyone turned to look at her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I was at that new club downtown a few months ago, you know, the exclusive one, and I saw this guy who looked exactly like the man you described. Tall, dark, expensive suit. He was throwing money around like it was nothing, buying drinks for every girl in the place. She paused for dramatic effect, her lips curving into a cruel smile. "He left with 3 different women that night. 3. The room spun around me. That's not possible." "Oh, honey," Sarah continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It gets worse." I asked around about him. Turns out he's got quite the reputation. Rich guy who likes to play house with naive girls until he gets bored. Word is, he's got women stashed all over the city. You probably weren't even his only girlfriend at the time. "That's not true," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. The Alexander I knew wouldn't do that. He couldn't. But then again, the Alexander I knew wouldn't have disappeared without a word either. "Emma," my father said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "how could you be so careless, so stupid? Do you have any idea what this does to our family's reputation?" "Your reputation?" I stared at him in disbelief. "I'm pregnant and alone, and you're worried about your reputation?" "You made your choice," my mother said coldly. "You chose to get involved with some playboy. You chose to get pregnant by a man who clearly has no intention of taking responsibility. These are the consequences of your actions." "I didn't choose for him to leave," I said, tears streaming down my face now. "I didn't choose to be abandoned." "You chose to spread your legs for a stranger," Sarah said with vicious satisfaction. "You chose to be exactly what everyone always knew you were." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "It means," my father said, standing up and looking at me with disgust, "that you've always been irresponsible, always making poor decisions, always bringing shame to this family, and now you've really done it." "I haven't brought shame to anyone," I said, my voice growing stronger despite my tears. "I fell in love with someone I thought loved me back. I got pregnant. These things happen." "To sluts," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "These things happen to sluts." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. I looked around the room, at my parents, at my brother, at his girlfriend, and saw nothing but judgment and disgust. No compassion, no support, no love. "I can't believe you just said that," I whispered. "Well, what else would you call it?" my mother asked. "Getting pregnant by some random man who doesn't even want you? Moving from apartment to apartment, job to job, never settling down, never being responsible?" "I have been responsible," I protested. "I graduated college. I have a good job. Had a good job. Marcus corrected without looking up from his phone. Sarah told me you got fired last month. I stared at him in shock. How did you... Sarah has friends everywhere, he said with a shrug. Word gets around. I turned to Sarah, who was watching me with predatory satisfaction. You've been keeping tabs on me? Someone has to look out for this family's interests, she said smoothly. And honey, your interests definitely don't align with ours anymore. The pieces were starting to come together in my mind. Sarah's mysterious knowledge about Alexander, her convenient appearance at the club, her friends who somehow knew about my job situation, the way she'd been pushing my parents' buttons all evening. You're lying, I said suddenly, about Alexander, about all of it. You're lying. Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Prove it. But I couldn't prove it. I had no way to contact Alexander, no way to verify her story, no way to defend myself against her accusations. I was alone, pregnant, and facing the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I think you should leave, my father said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. Leave? This is my home. This is our home, my mother corrected, and we won't have you bringing this kind of shame under our roof. Mum, please, I begged, my hands pressed against my stomach. I'm 6 months pregnant. I have nowhere else to go. You should have thought of that before you got yourself into this situation, she replied, not even looking at me. Marcus, I turned to my brother desperately. Please, I'm your sister. He finally looked up from his phone, his expression completely indifferent. Sorry, Emma, you made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. Sarah stood up and walked over to me, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear her whisper, I warned you to stay away from my family. Now you'll learn what happens when you don't listen. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't about Alexander or my pregnancy or my supposed irresponsibility. This was about Sarah wanting me gone, wanting to ensure her place as the only important woman in Marcus's life. She'd orchestrated this entire confrontation, fed my parents lies and half-truths, and manipulated the situation to get exactly what she wanted. You did this, I breathed, staring at her in horror. You planned this whole thing. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. I have no idea what you're talking about. But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes were triumphant. Get out, my father said, his voice final. Get out of our house. And don't come back until you've figured out how to clean up this mess you've made. And if I can't, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then I guess you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices, my mother said, turning back to her magazine as if I'd already ceased to exist. I looked around the room one more time, at the family photos that barely included me, at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, at the home that had never really felt like home. And I realized that I'd been fooling myself for years. I'd never been a real member of this family. I'd always been an outsider they tolerated. And now they didn't even want to do that anymore. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll leave, but don't expect me to come crawling back when you realize what you've done. We won't, Sarah said sweetly. Trust me. I walked upstairs to my childhood bedroom, the room that had never been redecorated since I was 12, still decorated with faded boy band posters and participation trophies from activities I'd tried and quit. I packed a single suitcase with clothes, a few photos, and the little money I had saved. Everything else, my books, my diploma, my childhood memories, I left behind. As I walked back downstairs, suitcase in hand, I could hear them already discussing Marcus's upcoming promotion, as if the last hour had never happened, as if I had never happened. I paused at the front door, looking back one more time. "Goodbye," I said quietly. Nobody responded. Nobody even looked up. I stepped out into the cold November night, 6 months pregnant and completely alone. Behind me, the house was warm and bright and full of my family's laughter. Ahead of me was nothing but darkness and uncertainty. But as I walked away from the only home I'd ever known, carrying my unborn children and whatever dignity I had left, I made myself a promise. Someday, somehow, I would prove them all wrong. Someday, they would realize exactly what they'd thrown away. I just never imagined it would happen the way it did. The morning of Marcus's wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect September day that wedding planners dream about. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse bedroom, adjusting the collar of my custom-tailored Armani blazer. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the broken, pregnant girl who'd been thrown out 3 years ago. "Mom, the cars are ready," my head of security, James, announced from the doorway. Behind him, I could see the twins getting their bow ties adjusted by their nanny, Mrs. Chen. Ethan and Lucas looked like little princes in their matching navy suits, their dark hair, so much like their father's, perfectly styled. "Are you sure about this, Emma?" Catherine Wilson asked, appearing beside James. My attorney and closest friend looked elegant in her charcoal grey dress, but her expression was concerned. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your family will know everything." I smoothed my hands down my blazer, feeling the weight of the Blackstone family ring on my finger. A 20-carat sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother. "They made their choice 3 years ago, Catherine. Today, they get to live with the consequences." The drive to the Cathedral of St. Matthew took 20 minutes through downtown Chicago traffic. I sat in the back of the lead Bentley with the twins, watching the city blur past through tinted windows. Behind us, 2 more black SUVs carried my security detail, and Catherine. The whole convoy screamed money and power, exactly the impression I wanted to make. "Mommy, why are we going to see the people who made you cry?" Lucas asked, his small hand finding mine. At 3 years old, he was the more sensitive of my twins, always picking up on emotional undercurrents that others missed. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, people need to see the truth," I replied, squeezing his hand gently. "And sometimes the truth surprises everyone." Ethan, ever the practical one despite his age, looked up from his tablet. "Are these the bad people who didn't want us?" Out of the mouths of babes. "They're not bad people, honey. They just made some very poor choices. But today, we're going to show them who you really are." The Cathedral of St. Matthew was the kind of venue that screamed old money and social prominence. Sarah had chosen it specifically because it was where all the right people got married, where society pages photographed the events, where connections were made and status was displayed. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd picked the perfect stage for her own downfall. As our convoy pulled up to the cathedral, I could see the wedding guests milling about outside, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Designer dresses, expensive suits, the kind of people who measured their worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. My parents stood near the front steps, my mother wearing a pale blue dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. My father in a tuxedo that fit him like it was made for him. Which it probably was. They looked exactly the same as they had 3 years ago. Polished. Perfect. Utterly convinced of their own righteousness. "Showtime," I murmured to Catherine as James opened my door. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to stare at the woman stepping out of the Bentley. I'd planned my appearance carefully. The Armani blazer over a silk camisole, tailored pants that cost more than Sarah's wedding dress, and jewellery that could have funded a small country's GDP. But it was the confident way I carried myself that really caught their attention. This wasn't the broken, desperate girl they remembered. This was a woman who owned every room she entered. James and another security officer flanked me as I walked toward the cathedral entrance, my heels clicking authoritatively on the stone steps. Behind me, Mrs. Chen guided Ethan and Lucas, their little hands clasped together as they took in the grandeur around them. I saw the exact moment my parents recognized me. My mother's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone steps. My father's face went completely white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Around them, other guests began to whisper and point, clearly recognizing that something dramatic was unfolding. "Emma?" my mother whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. I walked past them without acknowledgement, my security detail creating a protective barrier around me and the twins. We entered the cathedral like visiting royalty, and in many ways that's exactly what we were. The interior of the cathedral was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, stained glass windows that cast colourful light across marble floors, and enough flowers to stock a small florist shop. Wedding guests filled the pews, craning their necks to see the mysterious woman who'd arrived with such obvious wealth and importance. I chose seats in the third row on the groom's side, close enough to see everything but far enough back to make an entrance when the time was right. Catherine sat beside me while Mrs. Chen settled between the twins on my other side. James and the rest of my security took positions around the cathedral, their presence both discreet and unmistakable. "My God," I heard someone whisper behind me. "Who is that woman? She looks like she could buy this entire cathedral." "I heard she arrived with a full security detail," another voice added. "And those children, they're absolutely beautiful. Look at those suits." The whispers continued, building to a low buzz of speculation. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, but I kept my gaze fixed forward, projecting the kind of serene confidence that came from knowing you held all the cards. Marcus appeared at the altar looking handsome in his custom tuxedo, but I could see the moment he spotted me. His face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, confusion, and then something that might have been fear. He leaned over to whisper something to his best man, who immediately turned to stare in my direction. The wedding march began, and all heads turned toward the back of the cathedral as Sarah made her entrance. She looked stunning in her designer gown, a creation of silk and lace that had probably taken months to make. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, basking in the attention and admiration of the assembled guests. But I could see the exact moment she spotted me. Her step faltered just slightly, and her bouquet trembled in her hands. Our eyes met across the crowded cathedral, and I saw recognition, confusion, and then something that looked suspiciously like panic flash across her face. The ceremony proceeded according to tradition, but there was an undercurrent of tension that even the most oblivious guests could feel. Marcus stumbled over his vows, his eyes repeatedly drifting to where I sat with my mysterious children. Sarah's voice shook as she promised to love and honour, and I wondered if she was thinking about the lies she'd told to get to this moment. During the exchange of rings, Lucas tugged on my sleeve. "Mummy, why does the lady in the white dress keep looking at us?" "Because she's never seen princes before, sweetheart," I replied, loud enough for the people around us to hear. "She's just curious about who you are." The word princes rippled through the nearby pews like a stone thrown into still water. I could see heads turning, people straining to get a better look at my sons, speculation building like a gathering storm. The minister pronounced Marcus and Sarah husband and wife. They kissed to polite applause, and then came the moment I'd been waiting for. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, Sarah's eyes found mine again. This time, there was no mistaking the fear in her gaze. The reception was held at the Palmer House Hilton, in a ballroom that had hosted presidents and royalty. I made my entrance after most of the guests had arrived, ensuring maximum impact. The twins walked beside me, their little faces serious and dignified, while Catherine followed behind with a leather portfolio that contained enough legal documents to change everyone's understanding of reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Master of Ceremonies announced, "please welcome the bride and groom, Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Martinez." The applause was thunderous as Marcus and Sarah entered the ballroom, but I noticed how quickly the attention shifted to my table. We'd been seated at table 3, close enough to the head table to be seen, but positioned strategically for maximum dramatic effect. During dinner, I could feel my parents' eyes on me constantly. They sat at the family table, whispering urgently to each other, clearly trying to work up the courage to approach. Several other guests had already attempted to introduce themselves, drawn by curiosity about the elegant woman with the beautiful children and the obvious security detail. "Excuse me," a well-dressed woman had approached during the appetizer course. "I'm Linda Hartwell from the Society pages. I don't believe we've met." "Emma Blackstone," I replied smoothly, extending my hand. "And these are my sons, Ethan and Lucas." The name Blackstone had the intended effect. Linda's eyes widened, and I could practically see her mental Rolodex spinning as she tried to place the name. "Blackstone, as in Blackstone Holdings?" "Among other things," I replied with a mysterious smile. Linda excused herself quickly, and within minutes I could see her whispering urgently to other guests, spreading the news of my identity through the room like wildfire. The Blackstone name carried serious weight in Chicago's business community. Everyone knew about the mysterious billionaire who died in a plane crash, leaving behind one of the largest fortunes in the country. As the evening progressed, the whispers grew louder. People were beginning to put pieces together, remembering news reports about Alexander Blackstone's death. Speculation about hidden heirs, and the mysterious woman who'd suddenly appeared to claim his empire. During the toasts, Marcus's best man made the usual jokes about marriage and responsibility, but his words seemed to fall flat in the tension-filled room. Sarah's maid of honour gave a speech about friendship and loyalty that made me want to laugh out loud, given what I knew about Sarah's capacity for both. Finally, it was my father's turn to speak. He stood up slowly, his face pale but determined, and tapped his champagne glass with his fork. "As the father of the groom," he began, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "I want to welcome everyone who's here to celebrate this joyous occasion. Family is everything, and today we celebrate the joining of two families." His eyes found mine across the room, and his voice faltered. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he seemed to lose his train of thought, staring at me and the twins with an expression of dawning recognition. "Dad?" Marcus prompted from the head table, his own voice tight with tension. My father cleared his throat and tried to continue, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Finally, he raised his glass in a half-hearted toast and sat down heavily, his face ashen. That's when Catherine stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her lawyer's voice carrying clearly across the room. "I'm Catherine Wilson from Wilson, Hayes and Associates. I have an announcement that I believe will be of interest to everyone here." A hush fell over the ballroom. This wasn't part of the planned program, but something about Catherine's presence, her confidence, her obvious authority, commanded attention. 3 years ago, Catherine continued, Alexander Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Holdings, died tragically in a plane crash. At the time of his death, Mr. Blackstone was survived by his widow and twin sons, who have recently come forward to claim their inheritance. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could see the colour draining from Sarah's face, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward our table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine said, her voice ringing with authority, "I'd like you to meet Emma Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Holdings, and her sons, Ethan and Lucas Blackstone, heirs to the Blackstone fortune." The explosion of whispers that followed was like a dam bursting. Guests turned in their seats, straining to get a better look at us. Camera phones appeared, despite the no photography rule. I could see reporters in the crowd. Sarah had invited society journalists to cover her perfect wedding, never dreaming they'd witness something far more newsworthy. I stood up slowly, every movement calculated for maximum impact. The Cartier diamond necklace at my throat caught the light, throwing rainbows across the white tablecloth. Beside me, Ethan and Lucas stood as well, their small faces serious and dignified. "Thank you, Catherine," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "I want to thank Marcus and Sarah for this beautiful celebration. It's given me the perfect opportunity to introduce my sons to their extended family." I turned to look directly at my parents, who were staring at me in absolute shock. "Mom, Dad, I'd like you to meet your grandsons. Ethan, Lucas, those are your grandparents." The twins, perfectly coached, gave small, polite bows. "Hello," they said in unison, their voices clear and sweet. My mother made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. My father looked like he might faint. Around them, the other guests at the family table were leaning in, clearly trying to process what they were witnessing. I know this is a surprise, I continued, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on my parents. 3 years ago, when I was pregnant with Alexander's children, I came to my family for support. Unfortunately, they chose to believe lies instead of trusting their own daughter. They threw me out of their house, 6 months pregnant, with nowhere to go. The silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop. Sarah was gripping Marcus's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face, a mask of barely controlled panic. At the time, I didn't know who Alexander really was. I didn't know about his fortune, his companies, his legacy. All I knew was that I loved him and that I was carrying his children. But my family decided that I was an embarrassment, a disappointment, someone who didn't deserve their support or their love. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. They were wrong about a lot of things, but they were especially wrong about the father of my children. Catherine stepped forward with her leather portfolio. The DNA tests are all here, she announced, along with the legal documents establishing Emma's marriage to Alexander Blackstone and her children's legitimacy as his heirs. Everything has been verified by multiple independent laboratories and certified by the probate court. The room erupted. Guests were talking over each other, pulling out phones, trying to process the bombshell they'd just witnessed. Several people were already heading for the exits, no doubt eager to spread the news to anyone who would listen. But I only had eyes for my family. Marcus was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Sarah looked like she might be sick, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide her terror. And my parents looked like their entire world had just collapsed around them. "Emma," my mother whispered, standing up on unsteady legs. "Emma, we didn't know. You didn't want to know," I replied calmly. "You chose to believe the worst about your own daughter rather than give her the benefit of the doubt. You threw me away like garbage, and now you want to claim credit for the success you had nothing to do with." "But we're family," my father said desperately, taking a step toward me. "You're our daughter. Those boys are our grandsons." "No," I said, my voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't choose lies over love. Family doesn't throw pregnant daughters out in the cold because it's inconvenient." Security had formed a protective circle around us, keeping the increasingly agitated crowd at bay. I could see reporters pushing forward, trying to get closer, their cameras flashing despite James's attempts to block them. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the room one final time, my voice carrying over the chaos. "I want to thank you all for witnessing this moment. My sons needed to see their extended family, to understand where they come from and why they're better off without certain influences in their lives." I turned back to my parents, who were both reaching toward me now, desperation written across their faces. "Emma, please," my mother begged. "We made a mistake. We can fix this. We can be a family again." "You made your choice," I replied, picking up Lucas while Ethan took my hand. "Now I'm making mine." We walked toward the exit, our security detail clearing a path through the crowd of onlookers. Behind us, I could hear my parents calling my name, could hear Sarah's voice, raised in panic, as she tried to control the narrative that was already spinning out of her grasp. "Mrs. Blackstone," a reporter called out as we reached the door. How does it feel to go from homeless to billionaire? I paused, turning back to face the room full of people who'd just witnessed the most dramatic wedding reception in Chicago's social history. It feels like justice, I said simply. Then we were gone, leaving behind a room full of chaos, a wedding that would be talked about for decades, and a family that had finally realized what they'd thrown away. As our convoy pulled away from the hotel, I could see my parents on the sidewalk, calling after our cars, their faces stricken with the realization of what they'd lost. In the distance, I could see Sarah in her wedding dress, arguing frantically with Marcus, while reporters surrounded them like sharks. "Mommy," Ethan said from his car seat, "why were those people crying?" "Because they finally understood the truth, sweetheart," I replied, settling back against the leather seats. "And sometimes the truth is the hardest thing in the world to face." Catherine squeezed my hand. "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a moment, watching the city lights blur past the window. 3 years ago, I'd been broken, pregnant, and alone. Tonight, I was one of the most powerful women in America, with 2 beautiful sons and a future full of possibilities. "Free," I said finally. "I feel free." But I knew this was just the beginning. My family would come looking for reconciliation now that they knew who I really was. They'd want to be part of the Blackstone legacy, to claim their piece of the fortune they'd rejected when it came wrapped in an inconvenient pregnancy. The question was, would I let them? As we drove through the Chicago night toward our penthouse, I made a mental note to have Catherine draft some very specific legal documents. My parents wanted to be family now that it was profitable. But they were about to learn that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. The game was just beginning, and for the first time in my life, I held all the cards.